It was an ordinary Sunday morning at our countryside home. Sarah and I sat on the porch, the early sun casting a golden hue over the fields stretching beyond our backyard. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the damp earth, still carrying traces of last night's rain. It was the kind of peaceful morning I had always loved, the kind that made me feel like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. We were talking about the usual things: bills, repairs, our upcoming trip to visit her parents. I wasn't really thinking about the conversation too much, just responding out of habit. It was comfortable, predictable, the way life had been for years. And then I asked her, without thinking, "Did you pay the insurance?" She didn't hesitate, didn't even look up from her coffee as she said, "I'm not your responsibility, Liam." Her words cut through the morning air, sharp and sudden, as if I had asked something far more offensive. My fingers stiffened around the coffee mug. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds before forcing a nod, acting like I hadn't just felt the ground shift beneath me. "All right," I said, keeping my voice even. But something about the way she said it got under my skin. "Not your responsibility." It was a simple statement, but the way she said it, calm, almost dismissive, made it feel like she was saying something else entirely. Like she was drawing a line I hadn't realized existed. I should have let it go. Should have moved on and let the conversation return to the usual rhythm. But instead, I just sat there, staring at my coffee, feeling something tighten in my chest. Had I been treating her like she was my responsibility? I had always thought of myself as someone who took care of things. I handled the bills, made sure the cars were maintained, took care of the yard. I did those things not because I thought Sarah couldn't, but because that was just how I was wired. But now, for the first time, I wondered if she had seen it differently all along. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, fixing the loose cabinet door in the kitchen, taking out the trash, answering emails, but I wasn't really present. The thought kept circling in my head, refusing to leave me alone. By the time night fell, I still hadn't figured out what bothered me more: the fact that Sarah had said it, or the fact that it made me question everything I thought I knew about our marriage. She went to bed before me, as she often did. I stayed in the living room for a while, staring at the muted television, not really watching whatever was on the screen. The house felt different somehow, like I was standing inside a place I had known my entire life but suddenly couldn't recognize. Eventually, I went upstairs and found her already asleep, curled away from me. I slid into bed beside her, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. I had spent years making sure our life ran smoothly, but if Sarah saw that as control, as me treating her like something I owned, then maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to let go of the role I had been playing for so long. If she didn't want to feel dependent, I would give her exactly what she asked for. And I had a feeling she wouldn't like it as much as she thought she would. The next morning, I woke up before Sarah. Normally, I'd get out of bed quietly, go downstairs, and start making breakfast for both of us. It had been part of our routine for years. I'd brew the coffee, scramble the eggs, maybe even make toast if I was feeling ambitious. By the time Sarah came down, she'd find a warm plate waiting for her. But not today. Instead, I got out of bed, dressed in my running gear, and left the house without a word. The air was crisp, the kind of early morning chill that made my lungs burn as I jogged down the empty country road. I had gotten out of the habit of running regularly, always too caught up in chores and responsibilities to make time for myself. It felt strange to be moving like this again, pushing my body forward, feeling the tension in my legs with each step. When I got back, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her hair still messy from sleep, staring at the empty stove. She looked up at me as I walked in, her eyebrows pulling together slightly. "You went running?" I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, twisting the cap off. "Yeah." She glanced at the clock. "I thought we were going to have breakfast." I took a long sip of water before answering. "I wasn't hungry." She didn't say anything after that, but I could feel her watching me. I ignored it and went upstairs to shower. The rest of the morning felt off. Usually, I'd be the one reminding Sarah about the little things. Picking up groceries, making sure we left on time for whatever errands we had planned. But today I said nothing. I let the silence stretch. I let her notice the things I normally took care of. When the sink started leaking, I didn't reach for my toolbox. I saw it, made a note of it in my head, and walked right past it. When she came downstairs later, dressed and ready to go out, she hesitated near the door. "Are you coming with me?" "Where?" I asked, pretending I didn't know. "The farmer's market," she said slowly. "We always go on Sundays." I shrugged. "Go ahead without me." I didn't miss the way her lips pressed together in frustration before she grabbed her keys and left. This was the first time in years I had let things go, and Sarah was starting to notice. By the time she got back, I was in the garage, tuning up my old bike. Another thing I hadn't touched in a long time. She carried in the bags of Produce herself, setting them on the counter a little harder than necessary. "The faucet is leaking," she said. "I know." Her jaw tightened. "Aren't you going to fix it?" I wiped my hands on a rag, glancing at her. "You can call a plumber if you want." Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she turned and started putting the groceries away with sharp, deliberate movements. I watched her for a moment before turning back to my bike. Sarah wanted independence. I was giving it to her. The rest of the day passed in strange silence. I could feel the tension between us growing, but I didn't acknowledge it. I went about my day as if nothing had changed. That evening, she spent longer than usual on the phone with her friends. Normally, I'd wait for her to finish before we went to bed together. But this time I didn't bother. I turned off the lights, went upstairs, and got into bed without saying goodnight. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of her shifting beside me. She wasn't asleep. Neither was I. Neither of us said a word. The next few days followed the same pattern. I stopped waking up early to make her breakfast. I didn't remind her about bills, appointments, or errands. When something around the house needed fixing, I let it sit. It wasn't as if I was punishing her. I was just giving her exactly what she wanted: independence. First, Sarah acted like she didn't notice. She still went about her usual routine, still talked to me in the same casual way, still assumed I would handle the things I always had. But little by little, the cracks started to show. She forgot to take out the trash on Tuesday, so by Wednesday morning, the smell in the kitchen was impossible to ignore. I didn't say anything about it. I just drank my coffee and watched as she hesitated by the overflowing bin. Her lips pressed into a thin line. When the electricity bill came in, she left it on the counter like she always did, assuming I would take care of it. I didn't. 2 days later, she found it still sitting there, unopened. "Did you see the bill?" she asked. "Yeah." She waited, expecting me to say something else. When I didn't, she finally said, "Are you going to pay it?" "You can handle it," I said simply. Her brows furrowed slightly, but she said nothing as she grabbed the bill and walked off. By Friday, her patience was running thin. I came home from work to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen, arms crossed. The trash was still in the bin, the faucet still leaked, and the groceries she had bought were still sitting on the counter, unpacked. "Are we going to talk about this?" she asked. I set my bag down. "Talk about what?" She exhaled sharply. "You know what." I leaned against the counter, watching her. "I thought you didn't want to feel like my responsibility." She stiffened slightly. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Then what did you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the sink, twisting the knob under the faucet as if she was testing it. Water dripped steadily from the spout, the same way it had been all week. She started, then stopped, pressing her lips together. "You just what?" I prompted. She turned to face me again. "I just didn't want to feel like I wasn't in control of my own life." I nodded. "And now you are." She didn't seem to like that response. For a moment, we just stood there in silence, the sound of the dripping faucet filling the space between us. Then she turned, grabbed her keys from the counter, and walked out the door without another word. I didn't ask where she was going. She came back late that night. I was in bed by the time I heard the front door open and close. She moved around the house quietly, almost hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure what she would find. When she finally slipped into bed beside me, she let out a small sigh, barely audible in the darkness. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. By the next morning, something had shifted. Sarah wasn't as talkative as usual. She seemed distracted, preoccupied. When she left for work, she hesitated at the door, glancing back at me. Normally, I would have told her to have a good day. This time, I just nodded. That night, when she came home, she didn't go straight to her phone like she usually did. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood. I walked past her, opening the fridge. I had picked up just enough groceries for myself, nothing extra, nothing for both of us. "Did you eat already?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, grabbing a bottle of water. She nodded slowly. "I was going to make dinner." "You should," I said, taking a sip of water. Her fingers stopped tapping. "Are you seriously going to pretend like nothing's changed?" she asked finally. I set the bottle down on the counter and met her gaze. "I'm not pretending. You wanted independence. I'm giving it to you." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not what this is. You're trying to prove a point." "Maybe," I admitted, "but it doesn't make it any less true." She stared at me for a long time, as if trying to decide what to say next. Then, without another word, she got up and left the room. I didn't follow. That night, she didn't sleep as soundly as usual. I could feel the restless movement beside me, hear the way she sighed every now and then, turning from one side to the other. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally gotten her attention. The next morning, Sarah was up before me. That was unusual. Normally, she lingered in bed while I got ready. But today, she was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She had made coffee, but only for herself. A quiet retaliation. I smirked to myself as I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge instead. She wanted to play this game? Fine. She barely looked at me as she scrolled through her phone, her other hand absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. I sat across from her, stretching out the silence between us. Finally, she set the phone down and let out a breath. "Are we really doing this?" I raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" She gave me a flat look. "You know what?" I leaned back in my chair. "No, I don't. But if you want to talk, go ahead." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. "I just don't get what you're trying to prove." I took a slow sip of water. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just listening to you." Her jaw tensed. "That's not fair, Liam." I shrugged. "I thought fairness was part of the deal. You don't want to be taken care of. I'm respecting that." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're acting like I asked you to disappear." "No," I said. "You just asked me to stop treating you like my responsibility." A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance, maybe, frustration. But she didn't argue. Instead, she grabbed her bag and stood up. "I have to go." She left without saying goodbye. That night, I came home late. I had stayed out after work, grabbing dinner alone, taking my time instead of rushing home like I used to. When I walked through the door, Sarah was sitting on the couch, watching TV, but the second she saw me, she grabbed the remote and turned it off. "You're late," she said. I set my keys down. "Didn't know I had a curfew." She frowned. "That's not what I meant. You didn't even text." I shrugged, kicking off my shoes. "Didn't think I needed to check in with you." She pressed her lips together, clearly biting back whatever she really wanted to say. "Fine," she muttered. "Whatever." I smirked as I headed upstairs. The cracks were starting to show. The next few days, things got worse. She stopped waiting for me to eat dinner. I stopped asking her where she was going. The house, once full of comfortable silences, now felt like a waiting game, both of us seeing who would break first. I noticed she was staying out later than usual, coming home with a distracted look in her eyes, her phone constantly in her hand. Maybe she thought I'd ask. Maybe she wanted me to. I didn't. Then came the night everything changed. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the front door open and close softly. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Sarah never stayed out that late. I didn't move. I kept my breathing even, listening as she moved around downstairs. The sound of her keys dropping onto the table, her heels clicking against the floor, the hushed shuffle of fabric. I waited. Eventually, she crept up the stairs and slipped into bed beside me. I felt the mattress shift, her body still tense from wherever she had been. She smelled different. Not bad, just different. Like perfume she didn't normally wear. Like a place that wasn't ours. I kept my eyes closed. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. But I knew. And now I wondered if she did too. The next morning, Sarah was already awake when I opened my eyes. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me, staring at the floor. I watched her for a moment, waiting to see if she'd turn around. She didn't. Instead, she stood, grabbed her phone from the nightstand, and walked out of the bedroom without a word. I listened as she moved through the house, the familiar sounds of her morning routine now feeling distant. The coffee machine whirred. The fridge door opened and closed. But everything felt off, like she was moving carefully, deliberately, afraid of making noise, afraid of waking me. I got up slowly, stretching the tension out of my shoulders before heading downstairs. She was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone with one hand, holding a steaming mug in the other. She didn't acknowledge me when I walked in. I opened the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. Late night. She flinched, just slightly, but recovered quickly. Had trouble sleeping, she said, not looking up. I twisted off the cap. That why you smelled like a bar when you came in? That got her attention. Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. Excuse me? I took a sip of water, meeting her gaze. You heard me. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. I went out for a drink. Is that a problem? Not at all, I said easily. Just didn't realize you were the type to drink alone. Her jaw tensed. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. I let out a short laugh, setting my water bottle down. Sure, clearing your head at a bar, dressed up, coming home after midnight? That's a new one. She exhaled sharply, setting her mug down with more force than necessary. Jesus, Liam, are you checking up on me now? I raised an eyebrow. Didn't have to. You weren't exactly subtle. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one side. So what? I need to tell you where I am every second of the day. That's rich, coming from you. You've been acting like a ghost for weeks. I smirked. And you don't like it, do you? Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe, or something closer to frustration. But she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her bag and her keys. I'm late for work. She left before I could say another word. I sat down at the kitchen table, tapping my fingers against the wood. Sarah had always been careful, always predictable. But last night something had changed. I just wasn't sure what. That night, she came home later than usual again. This time, she didn't even bother making an excuse. Just walked in, set her things down, and headed straight for the shower. I stayed on the couch, flipping through the channels without really watching anything. When she finally came downstairs, her hair still damp, she hovered near the doorway like she was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Are we seriously going to do this forever? I glanced at her. Do what? She scoffed. This, the silent treatment, the games. It's exhausting. I smirked, then stopped playing. Her expression hardened. You think this is all me? You pulled away first, Liam. Don't act like I'm the only one responsible for whatever's happening between us. I leaned back against the couch. You're right. Pulled away. And you hated it. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her fists clenching at her sides. I'm going to bed, she muttered. I didn't stop her. But as she walked away, I noticed the way her shoulders were tense. The way her steps were just a little too quick, like she was running from something. And I wondered if she even knew what that was. The next morning, she was quiet. She moved through the house as if she didn't want to be seen, avoiding eye contact, keeping her distance. I watched her, waiting. She was unraveling, and she knew it. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. Are you happy like this? I took a sip of coffee, setting the mug down slowly. Are you? She swallowed hard, looking away. I don't know. I nodded. Then maybe that's the real problem. She sat down across from me, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. I thought I wanted space, she admitted. I thought if I had more control over things, I'd feel better. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. And her eyes met mine, and for the first time in weeks, I saw it, the truth, the regret. I was wrong, she whispered. Silence stretched between us. Heavy, honest. She reached for my hand hesitantly, her fingers brushing against mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't close the gap either. Liam, she said softly, can we fix this? I let the moment hang. Then finally I spoke. That depends, I said. Are you ready to stop running? She inhaled sharply, blinking fast as if trying to hold something back. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. I am. And just like that, something shifted. Not a perfect ending, not a resolution, but the beginning of something new.